I have started lying about my hearing. When my wife asks me something from the next room, I let 2 beats pass before I answer, sometimes 3. I tell her I didn't catch it. The truth is, I caught every syllable the first time. I just need that extra moment to be certain it was her voice and not the refrigerator compressor cycling on, or the baseboard heater clicking against its bracket, or the small, dry rattle the storm window makes when the wind shifts against the side of the house. After enough years in a place where the silence has weight, you stop being able to trust the noise inside a normal room. Everything sounds, for half a second, like a transmission. Everything sounds, for half a second, like someone is trying to reach you and has been trying for a long time. My wife thinks I am going deaf. I have let her think that. It is easier than telling her that what I am actually doing, every time a sound comes from another part of the house, is waiting for the pause. The pause between the first half of a sentence and the second half. The pause where someone who is not in the room with you might choose to speak, if they were going to speak at all. I have been listening for that pause for 16 years. I do not know how to stop. I worked at a remote upper-air observation station in a high valley in the northern Rockies for almost 19 years. People hear that and they picture something romantic. A little log building, a weather vane. A man with a thermos walking out at sunrise to check a rain gauge. The reality was a flat-roofed concrete bunker about the size of a 2-car garage. Painted government tan. Tethered to the rest of the world by a single phone line, a UHF radio, and a dial-up modem we eventually upgraded to satellite. We released hydrogen weather balloons twice a day at midnight and noon Greenwich time, which translated to inconvenient hours local. We maintained the sensors. We kept the logs. We reported to a regional office 400 miles south. There were 2 of us assigned at any given time, working overlapping rotations of 14 days on, 7 days off. That number matters. 2 people. That was the entire population of my world for most of 2 decades. My partner during the winter of 2008 was a man named Dale Marston. He was 51 that year, 8 years older than me. He had been at the station longer than anyone else in the agency's history. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly, but built out of the kind of long pauses that make new people nervous. He drank his coffee black and bitter. He kept his beard trimmed short with a small pair of scissors he had owned for 30 years. He read paperback westerns in the evenings, always with the cover folded back against itself. And he could read a barograph trace the way a doctor reads an EKG. He had been married once, a long time before, and never spoke about it except to mention, very occasionally, that his ex-wife had remarried a dentist in Boise and seemed happy. He said it the way you would report a barometric pressure. A fact, neither good nor bad. If you have ever shared a small space with the same person for years at a time, you know that the relationship is not friendship, and it is not family. It is its own category. You learn the rhythm of another human being's breathing while they sleep. You learn the exact sequence of sounds they make when they wake up. The cough, the shuffle, the clearing of a throat, the scrape of a chair leg against the linoleum. You stop talking, because there's nothing left to say that hasn't already been said in some form across 1,000 previous evenings. The silence between you is not awkward. It is structural. It holds the room up. I tell you about Dale first because I want you to understand that what happened that winter was not the story of strangers trapped together. It was something more particular than that. It was the story of 2 men who already knew each other the way mountain animals know the territory of another animal of the same species. We respected each other. We did not interfere with each other. and I made a decision about him in the last weeks of February 2008 that I have never spoken about out loud, and that I'm not going to be able to fully explain, even now. I'm going to try to be honest in the telling. Honesty is not the same thing as understanding. I have had 16 years to learn that. The winter started ordinary. Heavy snowfall in early November, then a stable, brutally cold December. We were averaging -18 at night, -4 during the day. The station ran on propane heat backed up by a diesel generator, and we had a small wood stove in the common room for redundancy. We had a snowmobile, a track-equipped utility vehicle the agency called the Bombardier, and a buried fuel tank topped off in October by a contractor who came up the service road before the snowpack closed it for the season. Once that road closed, we were essentially on our own until April. Resupply, in an emergency, would come by helicopter out of the regional office, weather permitting. In that valley, weather rarely permitted. If you have ever lived somewhere the world has to make an effort to reach, you might already understand the small psychological shift that happens around mid-January. It is the moment you stop pretending you could leave if you wanted to. You couldn't. The decision was made for you back in October. From January through March, you are simply a feature of the landscape, like the radio tower or the propane tank. And you have to make peace with that, or you will lose your mind. Some people did. The agency had a whole protocol for it. They called it isolation stress. I always thought that was a polite phrase for what it actually was, which is the slow realization that the version of yourself you brought up the mountain is not going to be the version that comes back down. The first thing I noticed about Dale that winter was the radio. We monitored a few channels during the day, mostly out of habit. The Forest Service frequency, the Regional Aviation Channel, a couple of shortwave bands. At night, we usually switched everything off because the static could carry through the thin interior walls and keep you awake. But starting around the second week of December, I noticed Dale was leaving the UHF on at low volume in the common room when he went to bed. Not loud enough to hear words, just loud enough to maintain a constant low hiss of carrier static behind everything else. He never mentioned it. I never asked. That was the kind of station we ran. I told myself, at first, that he liked the company of the noise. People do that. My grandfather had slept with a transistor radio under his pillow for the last 20 years of his life, tuned to a station that played big band music until 2 in the morning. There are men who cannot fall asleep in real silence. I assumed Dale had become one of them. What changed, slowly, was how he reacted to it. In the second week of December, I came into the common room around 1 in the morning, after the midnight balloon release, and found Dale sitting at the folding table with his head tilted slightly toward the radio. He was not reading. The paperback was face down on the table beside his coffee. He was just listening. When I came in, he did not look up right away. He held up one finger, the way you hold up one finger when you are listening to the end of a sentence on the phone. He held it there for maybe 4 seconds. Then his hand dropped, and he turned and he said good evening to me as if nothing unusual had occurred. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than I needed to. The hiss was the same hiss it had been an hour before. I did not hear anything in it. I went to the desk to log the upper air data, and I told myself Dale had been half asleep, and I did not bring it up. Around the same time, his handwriting in the logs began to drift. Nothing dramatic. Dale had always written in a very particular small block printing, square and even, with a mechanical pencil he refilled from a tin of leads he kept in the same drawer for 9 years. In mid-December, the letters began to lean slightly forward. The numbers were still correct. The observations were still on time. but the letters tilted, the way a fence tilts after a wet spring, and certain shapes started to change. His lowercase a, which had always been a perfect closed circle with a vertical line, began to open at the top. His sevens, which he had crossed since he was in the Air Force in the 1970s, stopped being crossed for 2 days, then started being crossed again, then stopped. I noticed it because I had been reading his handwriting twice a day for 9 years. I would have noticed if he had started crossing his sevens. I noticed when he stopped. I want to pause and say something honestly. I noticed these things, and I filed them away. And I did not ask him about them. Not once. There is a kind of person who, in close quarters, mistakes constant check-ins for care. Dale was not that kind of person, and neither was I. We had built a working relationship on the premise that we did not pry. If something was going wrong with him, my job was to wait until he chose to tell me, and to be ready to listen when he did. That was the contract. I told myself I was honoring it. I think about that often now. Whether the contract was real, or whether I was using the contract to avoid the harder thing, which was just asking a man I'd spent half my professional life with whether he was all right. There is a version of me that would say I was being respectful. There is another version that would say I was being a coward. I'm not sure which one is closer to the truth, and I'm not sure it matters anymore. Both versions made the same decisions. The thing that should have made me act came on the night of January 7th. We had finished the midnight balloon release. The wind was high, gusting maybe 40 knots out of the northwest, and the wind chill on the launch pad was hovering near -50. The hydrogen had been slow to fill that night, the regulator stiff with cold, the balloon clumsy in my gloves. I came back in, peeled off the outer shell, hung it on the hook by the door, and went to log the data. Dale was in the common room with his back to me, sitting at the small folding table where we ate. He had a cup of coffee in front of him, untouched, the steam long gone. He was just sitting there. The UHF was on at low volume behind him. He was looking at the wall. I said his name. He didn't turn around. I said it again, a little louder, the way you do when you assume someone is half asleep. He blinked, slow, and then he turned his head and looked at me, and for about 2 full seconds, I had the distinct impression that he did not recognize me. Not in a confused way, in a curious way, the way you would look at a person who had walked into your house without knocking, and you were deciding whether you needed to be afraid of them. Then he smiled, the small, dry smile he always smiled, and said, "Sorry, thought I heard something on the radio." And he stood and poured the cold coffee into the sink and went to bed. I sat at the table after he left. The UHF was still hissing. I listened to it for a long time, the way he had been listening to it. I did not hear anything that sounded like a voice. I did not hear anything that sounded like a signal. I heard the carrier static of a radio left on an unused frequency in the middle of the night in a valley where there was nobody else for 60 miles. I told myself that whatever Dale had been listening for was inside his own head, and that there was nothing I could do about that. I went to bed. I'm going to ask you something, and I'm asking it not as a hook, but because I would genuinely like to know. If you have ever been around someone who started to slip in a way that was too quiet to name, what did you do? Did you say something? Did you wait? Did you tell yourself it was none of your business? I'm not asking to be reassured. I'm asking because, in my experience, most people wait. And then most people find some way to live with the waiting afterward. By the 3rd week of January, Dale had stopped sleeping on a normal cycle. He would do the midnight release with me, and then instead of going to bed at 1 in the morning, he would sit up in the common room until 4 or 5. The UHF still on, the paperback open in front of him, but unread. I could see, through the gap under my door, the thin strip of yellow light from the common room lamp going on, long after it should have been off. He would sleep until 10, then drift through the noon release like a man wading through deep water. He was still accurate. He was still doing his job. But there was a delay in him, a half-second lag between sound and response, between question and answer, that I had never seen in him before. I rerouted small tasks without making a thing of it. I took over the recalibration of the surface sensors, which Dale usually did because he had a steadier hand than I did. I took over the inventory check on the hydrogen cylinders, marking each one with the small grease pencil tick we had used for years. I started getting up earlier and making the coffee, which had always been his job because he made it stronger than I did, and I had given up complaining about it years before. I told myself I was being practical. He was older. The winter was harder this year than most. He had earned a little slack. That was the first lie I built, and I built it the way you build a wall. One small, careful brick at a time until the structure feels load-bearing and you forget you laid it yourself. The first small operational failure came on January 18th. We were running a routine calibration of the surface temperature sensor, which involved cross-checking it against a manual mercury thermometer mounted on the north wall of the building. The procedure was standard. We had done it together hundreds of times. Dale read the manual thermometer aloud, and I logged it. He read it as -22. I wrote it down. He read it again, 10 minutes later, as -26. I wrote that down too. Then he read it a third time, without prompting, and said -22 again, in the same, even voice. The temperature outside had not changed by 4 degrees in 10 minutes. I knew, and he knew, and neither of us said anything. I quietly went out a half hour later and read the thermometer myself, -23. I corrected the log with my own initials and did not mention it. Around the end of January, the regional office called for our monthly check-in. The calls were perfunctory: equipment status, supply needs, any incidents. I took the call from the small office at the back of the station while Dale was outside, raking ice off the launch pad. The regional supervisor, a woman named Carol, who had held the job for about 6 years, asked me if everything was all right with Dale. She said it in a casual tone, the way you might ask about a mutual acquaintance. But I understood immediately that the question was not casual. Someone had flagged something. Maybe his last vacation rotation. Maybe a phone call he had made that I did not know about. Maybe just the slow attrition of his voice on the daily reports. I told her Dale was fine. I told her the winter had been hard, that we were both tired, but that he was still hitting every release on time and that the data was clean. I told her there was nothing to worry about. I said all of this with the calm, slightly bored confidence of a man delivering a routine report. I did not mention the radio at night. I did not mention his handwriting. I did not mention the manual thermometer. I did not mention the 2 seconds in early January when he had looked at me as if I were a stranger. When I hung up, I sat at the desk for a few minutes. Outside, through the small reinforced window, I could see Dale on the pad, in his red parka, scraping at the ice with steady, even strokes of the rake. He looked exactly like he had looked for 9 years. The light off the snow was so bright it made the rest of the world look underexposed. I told myself I had protected him. That if I had told Carol what I had been noticing, the agency would have pulled him. They would have flown him out on the next weather window and put him through a medical evaluation. And depending on what they found, his career would have ended in a small clinical office 400 miles south, in fluorescent light, in front of a stranger with a clipboard. Dale would have hated that. He would have hated it more than almost anything I could imagine. I was sparing him. That was the second lie. It was thicker than the first one. It carried more weight. The truth, if I'm willing to say it, was simpler. If Dale was pulled out of the station, I would be alone in the valley until they could fly a replacement in. Depending on the weather, that could be a week. It could be a month. The agency had done it before. In emergencies, left a single observer running the station solo. It was technically against protocol, but in practice it happened. And I did not want to be alone in that bunker. Not for a week, not for a month, not for an hour longer than I had to be. I had been telling myself for years that I was the kind of man who could handle solitude. The job had let me believe that, because I had never actually been alone in the station. Dale had always been there. The idea of him being airlifted out and leaving me by myself in that valley, in that wind, with that UHF hissing at me from the common room, was something I did not want to look at directly. So I didn't. I told Carol everything was fine, and I went back to work. And I let the small, careful lies stack up between us like cordwood. If you find yourself wanting more stories that sit in this particular kind of discomfort, the kind where the choice underneath the choice is the actual subject, you might want to stick around for a while. I don't make a habit of pretending these stories have lessons. They don't. They have residue. The first time I heard something I could not explain was the night of February 1st. I want to be careful in the telling of this, because I've spent 16 years not being careful in the telling of it inside my own head. And I've learned that you can convince yourself of almost anything if you give it long enough. So I'm going to tell you only what I'm sure of. I had gone to bed around 2 in the morning after the midnight release. The wind was steady, maybe 20 knots, nothing remarkable. Dale was still up. The UHF was on. I had grown used to falling asleep against the low hiss of it through the thin interior wall between the common room and my bunk room. I woke up around 3:30. I could not say what woke me. The wind had not changed. The building was as still as it ever was. I lay there in the dark with my eyes open, listening, the way you do when something is wrong, and you have not yet identified what. After a while, I realized that the hiss of the radio was different. It is hard to describe. The carrier static of an unused UHF frequency has a particular texture. It is not white noise. It is finer and drier than that, with small variations in pitch as the receiver hunts for a signal that is not there. I had listened to that texture every night for 9 years. I knew it the way you know the sound of your own breathing. That night, the texture had a rhythm in it. Not a voice, not a word, a rhythm. Small, soft swells, maybe 2 seconds apart, regular as a slow pulse. They were quiet enough that I would not have noticed them if I'd not been lying perfectly still in the dark with nothing else to listen to. I lay there for a long time. I did not get up. I did not knock on the wall. I did not call Dale's name. I lay there, and I listened to the soft pulse inside the static. And I told myself, very deliberately, that it was the wind interacting with the antenna on the roof. That it was the generator cycling on its low setting in the equipment shed. That it was the propane heater clicking through its duty cycle, and that the sound was traveling through the metal walls and being picked up by the radio chassis, the way a guitar string picks up a hum from a nearby speaker. There were 6 perfectly reasonable mechanical explanations, and I rehearsed all of them in order, the way a man rehearses the words he is going to say at a job interview. What I did not do was get out of bed and go into the common room and look at the radio. Because I knew, in the way you know things in the middle of the night, without being able to defend them, that if I went into the common room, Dale would be sitting at the folding table, awake, head tilted slightly toward the receiver. And the question of what we were both listening for would become a real question. The kind that had to be answered out loud. And I was not ready for that. I fell asleep eventually. In the morning, the rhythm was gone, or I could no longer hear it. Dale was in the kitchen making coffee. He looked tired, but otherwise himself. He said good morning. He said the regulator on the hydrogen line was sticking, and that he wanted to check the seals on the manifold. We checked them together. The seals were fine. The regulator stopped sticking. We did the noon release. The numbers were good. I did not mention the night. He did not mention the night. We carried on. After that, I started to notice other things. I want to be careful here too, because once you start listening for something, you can find it almost anywhere. That is one of the things I learned that winter, and one of the things I have not been able to unlearn. The wind in the antenna guy wires, on certain nights, sounded almost like a held vowel. The pipes in the bathroom, when the water heater kicked on, made a low double thump that, if you were tired enough, sounded like a syllable repeated twice. The aluminum ducting in the ceiling, contracting against the cold, produced small ticks at intervals that were not quite random. I noticed all of these things, and I told myself, repeatedly, that I was noticing them because I had spent too many nights with too little to listen to, and because watching Dale listen had taught me to listen the same way. The brain is a pattern-finding organ. You give it static and time and isolation, and it will manufacture patterns out of nothing. That is what I told myself. That is what I still tell myself. But I started, in those weeks, to leave the UHF off when I was alone in the common room in the early morning. I told myself it was so I could hear the percolator. I do not think that was true. The second operational failure was on February 5th. The hydrogen valve on cylinder number 4 was found half open in the morning after a night release. Either Dale had not closed it fully after the launch, or I hadn't. Neither of us could remember which of us had handled that particular cylinder. The agency's safety protocol on cylinder valves was strict for a reason. Hydrogen leaking inside an enclosed shed in a building heated by propane and diesel is the kind of thing that ends a station. We checked the shed for accumulation. The vents had been adequate. Nothing had happened. Dale closed the valve, slowly, with both hands. He did not say anything. Neither did I. He logged the cylinder as secured. He did not log the fact that it had been left half open. Neither did I. That was the first time I knowingly let an unsafe procedure go unreported. I have cataloged it since, as the moment the contract between us changed from a contract about privacy into a contract about complicity. At the time, it just felt like discretion. A week before the storm, on a Tuesday afternoon, I almost asked him. We were in the equipment shed together, troubleshooting the diesel generator, which had started taking 3 or 4 attempts to catch on cold mornings. Dale was on his knees in front of it, with the access panel off, checking the glow plugs with a small handheld tester. I was holding the flashlight for him. The shed smelled of diesel and cold metal and the faint sharpness of old grease. The wind was up outside. I could hear it pushing against the metal siding in long, uneven gusts. I had a sentence in my mouth. I had been holding it for 2 weeks. The sentence was, "Dale, are you all right?" Just that. 5 words. I could feel the shape of them behind my teeth. He was working steadily, his breath visible in the cold of the shed, the small tester clicking against the terminals. He looked up at me, briefly, to take the flashlight from a better angle. His eyes were clear. He looked like a man who was concentrating on a job he knew how to do. I did not say it. I let the sentence dissolve. I held the light steady. He finished the test, declared the second glow plug weak, said he would swap it out from spares in the morning, and stood up with a small grunt of effort. I think about that afternoon often. The shape of those 5 words in my mouth. The exact angle of his face as he took the flashlight from me. There is a version of the rest of this story where I said the sentence, and he answered me in whatever form he could have answered, and what came afterward was different. I do not know if it was better. I only know it was different. I do not get to find out, because I did not say it. That was the last clean moment we had. 3 nights later, the storm came in. The forecast had been clear enough. A deep, low-pressure system tracking down from the Yukon, riding a steep pressure gradient, expected to bring sustained winds of 50 to 60 knots and heavy blowing snow. The kind of storm we had ridden out a dozen times. Nothing about the synoptic chart suggested anything historic. We battened the equipment. We brought the snowmobile and the bombardier into the lee of the building. We topped off the wood stove and confirmed the generator was warm. We did, in short, exactly what we had always done. Dale moved through the preparation the way he always had. Methodical, slightly slow, his gloved hands sure on the equipment, even when his eyes seemed to be focused on something half a beat behind the work. The storm hit harder than the forecast suggested. By midnight, the anemometer was registering gusts past 90 knots before the cup assembly froze solid and stopped reporting altogether. The temperature, with the wind factored in, was past anything our instruments were rated for. The station shook. The roof groaned in long, low complaints, the kind of sound a building makes when it is reminding you that it is held together by bolts and seals and the assumptions of engineers. The wood stove drew so hard that the flames inside it leaned sideways, sucked by the pressure differential at the chimney. The cast iron door of the stove rattled in its frame, ringing faintly with each gust. We had been through worse storms in raw wind speed, but the duration of this one, and the temperature behind it, was something different. By 2 in the morning, the wind had not dropped below 70 knots for more than a few seconds at a stretch. The whole building was vibrating at a low frequency I could feel in my teeth. We lost the propane line around 3. Something out on the supply run, probably ice loading on the regulator, took the heat down. The wood stove was still going, but the rest of the building cooled fast. Within an hour, the interior temperature had dropped to the low 30s. Frost began to form on the inside of the small window beside the desk. The water in the kettle on the counter began to skin over. We went into the cold weather protocol. We put on our shell layers indoors. We moved our bunks into the common room, close to the stove. We rationed the wood because the resupply was buried in a small lean-to 30 feet from the back door, and the visibility outside was effectively 0. We kept the generator running, but at reduced load to spare the diesel. We waited for the storm to break so we could go outside and fix the regulator. The storm did not break. It went on for almost 4 days. The kind of storm that makes you lose track of which side of the wall the wind is on. The pipes in the bathroom froze solid on the second night, despite the trickle we had left running. We melted snow for water in a pot on the stove, scooping it through a small gap we kept open at the back door, the snow refilling itself almost as fast as we could shovel it away. We did the balloon releases when we could, and skipped them when we couldn't, which was a small administrative sin we both accepted without discussion. The launch pad was unreachable by the morning of the second day. We rigged a tether line between the back door and the equipment shed using a length of climbing rope from the emergency kit. Because the visibility in the doorway was less than 3 feet and a man could become disoriented in the span of a few steps. We took turns going out, hand over hand on the line, to check the generator and bring in more wood. Every trip out cost something. By the second day, the skin on my cheeks was burned in small white patches I would not feel for hours. On the second night, Dale tried to repair the propane regulator. He should not have. I should not have let him. He was 51 years old, and he had not slept more than 90 minutes at a stretch in 3 weeks. But the propane was the difference between getting through the storm at 35 degrees indoors and getting through it at 50. And our wood was going faster than we could replace it from the lean-to. He suited up. He clipped himself to the tether. He went out with a small bag of tools and a headlamp that the wind threatened to tear off his head. He was gone for 40 minutes. From inside, I could not see him through the window. The blowing snow was a solid white wall against the glass. I sat by the stove with the kitchen timer in my hand. I had set it for 30 minutes, which was the threshold at which I had told myself I would clip in and go out after him. The timer rang. I reset it for 10 more. I told myself I was being patient. The truth was, I did not want to go out into that wind. And I was hoping the door would open before I had to decide. The door opened at the 38-minute mark. Dale came in on his hands and knees, the tether bunched in one fist, his headlamp gone, his beard a solid plate of ice. He could not stand. He could not, for a moment, speak. I got him to the stove. I peeled the outer layer off him. The cold had gone deep into his hands. I made him drink warm water. He shivered hard enough to rattle the cup against his teeth. He had not fixed the regulator. He had not been able to find it in the blowing snow. He had spent 38 minutes a few feet from the exterior wall, working by feel, until his hands had stopped working. He apologized. He said it 3 times, in a thin, embarrassed voice that I had never heard come out of him in 9 years. I told him to shut up and rest. He did. He slept for an hour. Then he was up again, sitting by the stove, his hands wrapped around a fresh mug. He did not say anything. He stared into the small, visible flame at the gap in the stove door. The UHF was on in the corner, where we had moved it with the bunks. The hiss of it was constant under everything. I noticed, on the 3rd day of the storm, that I had started to listen to the static the way Dale listened to it. I caught myself doing it once, around 10 in the morning. I was sitting at the folding table with my second cup of coffee, my head tilted slightly toward the receiver, my hands very still around the mug. I had been doing it for I do not know how long. Maybe a minute, maybe 5. There was a small, soft swell in the hiss, slow and regular, that I'd been following with my breath without meaning to. When I noticed, I jerked my head straight and stood up too fast and went to the window and looked at the white wall of snow on the glass until my pulse settled. I told myself it was exhaustion. We had not slept properly in 3 days. We had been cold for longer than the body is supposed to tolerate without consequences. The brain, deprived of sleep and warmth and contrast, will reach for any rhythm it can find. I told myself this very deliberately. I told myself it twice. I went back to the table. I sat with my back to the radio. I did not look at it for the rest of the morning. But I could hear it. I could not stop hearing it. And I began to understand, in a way I had not before, why Dale sat with his head tilted toward the receiver. It is easier to listen on purpose than to be listened at by accident. On the 3rd night, Dale began to deteriorate visibly. He had been the steadier of the 2 of us up to that point, oddly. The crisis had pulled him out of whatever fog he had been moving through. And for the first 2 days of the storm, he'd been sharper than I had seen him all winter. He had managed the stove. He had rigged a secondary heat shield out of an emergency blanket and a few pieces of plywood. He had been the man I had worked with for 9 years. I remember being grateful, in a quiet way, that the version of him I had been protecting was still in there. But on the third night, the cold started to work on him. He was older than me. He had less mass. He had been sleeping badly for weeks before the storm even started. He began to shiver in a way that did not stop when he sat by the stove. His speech began to slur slightly. He misjudged the distance to objects, knocking over a cup, missing the handle of the wood box on his first reach. The early stages of hypothermia, the kind they teach you to recognize in the basic safety course every year. I got him into the warmest sleeping bag we had. I put him close to the stove. I made him drink warm water in small sips. I added more wood than I should have, given our rations, because keeping him warm seemed more important than keeping us warm 2 days from now. He stopped apologizing, which worried me more than the apologies had. He just lay there, his eyes half closed, watching the small, visible flame. Around 2 a.m, he spoke. His voice was slow, but very clear. He said, "You can hear it now too, can't you?" He was not looking at me. He was looking at the stove. I did not answer him. I sat very still on the folding chair I had pulled close to his bunk. The UHF was on at low volume on the shelf above his head. The hiss filled the small space between us. After a long moment, he closed his eyes, and his breathing slowed into something that looked like real sleep. I do not know if he had been asking me a question or telling me something he already knew the answer to. I have spent 16 years deciding it was the fever, the cold, the early hypothermia speaking through him. I have spent 16 years being almost sure of that. In the small hours of the fourth night, with the wind still screaming, I sat by the stove and watched him sleep. And I made the decision I've not talked about for 16 years. The satellite phone was in a hard case on the shelf above the desk. It was for emergencies. It worked, even in the storm, as long as you could get a line of sight to the sky for a few minutes, which meant going outside, briefly, into a shielded spot on the lee side of the building. The protocol, in a medical emergency in the middle of a storm, was clear. You called the regional office. You described the patient's condition. You requested an emergency evacuation as soon as the weather window opened. Even if the helicopter could not come for a day or two, the call started the clock. It got Dale into the system. It also, importantly, transferred responsibility off of me and onto the agency. I sat by the stove with the satellite phone case on my lap, unopened, for a long time. What I told myself, in that moment, was that Dale was stable. He was warm. He was sleeping. His breathing was even. The early hypothermia was responding to the heat. If I called it in now, I would commit him to a medical evacuation he might not need. The helicopter crew would risk their lives flying into a valley that was still in the back half of a historic storm. The agency would scrutinize the station for the rest of the winter. And Dale, when he was lucid again, would know I had made the call without speaking to him first. He would know I had decided, on his behalf, that he was no longer capable of deciding for himself. For a man like him, that knowledge would be worse than the cold. That was the story I told myself. It was even partially true. Each piece of it, taken alone, was defensible. The piece I did not say to myself, not in language, was the other piece. If I called it in, and the helicopter came, Dale would leave, and I would be in the station alone, for however long the agency took to send a replacement, and the UHF would still be hissing in the common room at night, and I would have to find out, by myself, whether the small drifting things I'd been noticing in him for 2 months were actually in him, or whether they had been in the building all along, and had simply found him first because he was older and tireder and more available. I put the satellite phone back on the shelf. I fed the stove, I watched Dale sleep. I told myself I would reassess in the morning. By morning, the wind had finally started to slacken. By late afternoon, the storm had broken. Dale was awake. He was weak, and he was quiet, but he was lucid. He drank broth. He used the bathroom on his own. He sat by the stove and read a few pages of a Western paperback with the cover bent back. He thanked me for tending the stove. He did not remember most of the third night, which I was grateful for, because it meant he did not remember the small, embarrassed apologies, and I did not have to pretend I had not heard them. He did not, as far as I could tell, remember the sentence about the radio. I did not call it in. I logged the storm. I recorded the propane outage. I described Dale's condition in the most neutral language I could find. Mild cold exposure, fully recovered, no medical intervention required. I sent the report up the chain in the morning batch. Carol called 20 minutes after the report posted, and I told her, in the calm, bored voice of a man reading a routine summary, that we had written it out fine. She asked if we needed anything. I told her we needed a propane regulator and a new anemometer cup assembly when the weather allowed. She said she would have them on the next helicopter. We hung up. Dale was sitting at the folding table when I came out of the office. He looked at me for a moment. I had the impression again that he understood exactly what I had not said on the phone. He nodded once, slowly, and went back to his paperback. That was the moment, if there was one, when the contract between us changed. Not because anything was said, because nothing was said, and because both of us knew, and because both of us let it stay unsaid. We had been quiet around each other for 9 years out of habit. From that morning forward, we were quiet around each other on purpose. If you have stayed with me this long, I appreciate it. Most people would have clicked away by now. Most people prefer the part of a story where something happens. This is the part where nothing happens, for years, and the nothing is the thing. We finished out the winter. The propane regulator was replaced. The wind cup was replaced. The data went out on time. The UHF stayed on at night, at low volume, on the shelf above Dale's bunk in the common room, where it stayed even after we moved our beds back into our own rooms. He never turned it off, neither did I. I told myself the habit had simply transferred between us, the way habits do between two people who share a space for long enough. I told myself a number of things that winter, and I got very good at telling them. Spring came late that year, as it does in that valley. The road opened in mid-April. Dale rotated out for his scheduled leave at the end of April. He stood by the bombardier with his small duffel bag in his gloved hand, and he looked at me, and he said, "I'll see you in a few weeks." It was the most ordinary thing in the world. He had said it in almost exactly that cadence, for 9 years. He did not come back. He took medical leave during his rotation. The agency called me at the end of May to tell me Dale was retiring, effective immediately, for personal reasons. They were sending a replacement. They asked me if I had any concerns about his performance during the previous season that I needed to add to his file before it was closed. I told them no. I told them Dale had been one of the most reliable partners I had ever worked with, and that the station owed him a great deal. All of which was true. None of which was the conversation we were actually having. I stayed at the station for another decade. I worked with 3 different partners over those years. None of them were Dale. The first one, a man named Reyes, kept the radio off at night, which I appreciated more than I could explain to him. The second one liked talk shows in the evenings, which were oddly worse, because the human voices were close enough to the thing I was listening for that I caught myself, more than once, leaning toward them. I was promoted, eventually, to a small supervisory role that let me spend half my time at the regional office in town, which I accepted because by then I had a wife and a small house, and I had begun to want occasionally to come home to them. I retired 4 years ago. I sold the truck I'd used for the service road. I took up a few hobbies. I do not listen to the radio at night. Dale died in a veterans care facility in Boise the year after he retired. I learned about it through an agency newsletter, in a small paragraph at the bottom of the page. The newsletter said he had passed peacefully after a period of declining health, and that he was remembered fondly by colleagues. I read the paragraph twice. I folded the newsletter. I put it in a drawer. I did not go to the service. I told myself I had not been invited. That was true. It was also not the reason. The thing I have been left with, the residue I mentioned earlier, is not guilt. I want to be honest about that. Guilt is too clean a word for what this is. Guilt implies that there is a corresponding act of repair available, even if you never make it. What I have is something quieter, and it lives in the small spaces of the house I share with my wife. I notice, for example, that when she is in another room and she asks me a question, my body goes still for a moment before I answer. I am listening past her voice, for the pause where someone else might be speaking. I notice that I leave lights on at night, in rooms I'm not using, and that I have started telling her it is because I read somewhere it discourages break-ins, which is not the reason. I notice that I have not, in 16 years, told her any of this. She knows there was a winter in 2008 that was hard. She knows my partner from those years retired and died. She has asked me, gently, a few times, whether I want to talk about it. I have told her there is nothing to talk about. She does not press. We have our own quiet contract now. I built it without telling her I was building it. There is a particular thing I think about, and I'm going to tell you about it because I want this to be the last honest thing. And then I want to stop. About a month after Dale rotated out for the last time, while I was at the station with a new partner who did not yet know which side of the wall the wind was usually on, I found something in the small storage closet at the back of the bunker. It was a notebook, not a logbook. A personal notebook, cheap, with a soft cardboard cover, the kind you can buy at any drugstore. Dale's small block printing was on the inside cover, with his name and the year, 2007. He must have left it behind by accident in the rush of his last rotation, or he must have left it behind on purpose. I did not read it. I want to be clear about that. I held it in my hands for a long time. I felt the slight warp in the cardboard cover where the building's damp had gotten to it. I felt the small weight of all the pages he had filled. I opened the front cover, only the front cover, far enough to see his name written in his familiar tilted printing. And then I closed it again. I put it back on the shelf where I had found it, in the same position, with the same small drift of dust along its top edge. I left it there for the next 10 years. Every time I went into that closet for a sensor or a spare battery, I knew it was there. I did not move it. I did not open it. When I retired, I cleaned out the personal items at the station, and I left the notebook on the shelf, exactly where it had been. As far as I know, it is still there. My replacement was a young woman who I doubt has any reason to go looking for an old notebook on a back shelf. It will probably sit there until the building is decommissioned. It may sit there longer than that. I think about that notebook more than I think about almost anything else. From those years, I think about the version of myself who could have opened it in 2008 when Dale was still alive, and read whatever he had been writing during the months when his handwriting tilted forward and his voice slid out from under the door at night. I think about whether opening it would have given me a sentence I could have used. Something I could have said to him the next morning across the folding table. That would have been more useful than the silence I gave him instead. And I think, just as often, about the version of myself who could have opened it after he died, in the privacy of that closet, with nobody watching. That version could have read it as a kind of late conversation, a way of finally listening. That version could have closed the book and carried it down off the mountain with him, and done something with whatever was in it. Burned it, mailed it to Boise, anything. I did not do either of those things. I left the notebook on the shelf because as long as I did not open it, I could continue to believe I did not know what was in it. And as long as I did not know what was in it, I had not, technically, refused to help him. I understand now that this is not how knowing works. You can decline to read a thing and still be responsible for it. The information you choose not to acquire is still information you have made a decision about. I understood that in some form, even at the time. I just preferred not to look at it directly. My wife called me to dinner a few minutes ago, from the kitchen. I heard her. I let 2 seconds pass, the way I always do now, listening past her voice for the pause where the other speaker might come in. Then I answered her. I told her I would be right there. I am going to close this recording, and I'm going to go eat dinner with my wife. And I'm not going to mention any of this to her. That is not because I'm protecting her. It is because I have built a life, carefully, on top of a winter I do not talk about. And I'm not willing, even now, to test how much weight the structure can hold. I do not know what the right ending to this is. I do not think there is one. Dale is dead. The notebook is on a shelf in a concrete building in a valley I will never see again. The agency considers the matter closed. The station is still operational, on the same schedule it has always been, releasing balloons twice a day into the same sky. Somewhere in the recorded data from the winter of 2008, there is a small section, 4 days long, where the readings are sparse, and where if you knew what to look for, you might notice that 2 balloon releases were skipped without an explanation in the log. Nobody is going to look for that. Nobody has any reason to. I think about Dale most often in the early mornings, before my wife is up, when the house is still dark and the heater clicks on for the first time. There is a particular sound the propane igniter makes, a soft, even hiss before the burner catches. And for the first half-second of that sound, every morning, I am back in the common room at the station, in the dark, listening to him talk to someone who was not there. I am lying in my bunk, and I am not getting up. I am not crossing the room. I am not saying his name. I am letting the hiss go on, and I'm telling myself that whatever he is doing in there is private, and that the kind thing, the respectful thing, the correct thing, is to let him have it. Then the burner catches, and the heater starts, and I'm in my own house again, and my wife is asleep upstairs. And the only person I've failed to speak to in the last 16 years is, for the moment, still myself. I will probably keep it that way. That is the part I'm not proud of. That is also the part I'm not, at this point in my life, going to change. A man my age does not get to rebuild himself from the studs. He just gets to notice, more clearly each year, the shape of what he built, and to live inside it with the lights on.